Volcano Observatory. We've had a number of guests from our local staff, our incredible scientific team at the MVO and technical support team. And we've had a number of international guests as well. So I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have and learned a thing or two as well in the process. So today, I just want to run through, as we usually do, a little bit of the housekeeping. If you are on Facebook and you're watching us live, if you're experiencing any sort of technical difficulties, just log off and try to refresh your page and come back on. And for those of us who are listening at home on the radio, please feel free to call us on 491-7227. It's going to be an exciting discussion today, and we have some fantastic guests on. So we're looking forward to your participation. And if you are on a WhatsApp and you'd like to send us a WhatsApp message, just call our message 164-495-2029. Now today we have in the studio former Premier Reuben T. Mead, and he's a politician. When back in the day when we had chief ministers, Mr. Mead was chief minister in 1996 and 1999, 2009 and 2010. He was also premier during the period 2010 to 2014. And oftentimes on Ireland, we comment that former Premier Mead has been the man at the helm during most of our crisis and most eruptive states of the volcano as well. So we're looking forward to an interesting conversation there. We also have in the studio Major Alvin Ryan, and Major Ryan is the Director of Disaster Management Coordination Agency on Montserrat and the head of Defense Force. Major Ryan was helping to relocate and rehouse people into shelters, etc., during the volcanic crisis. And now the DMCA are authorizing access into Plymouth for various activities as well. We have on the line, we're pleased to have Dr. Richie Robinson. And Dr. Richie Robinson is a volcanologist at the Seismic Research Center, UE, in Trinidad and Tobago. We're so happy to have you with us. And finally, we have Professor Jenny Barkley. And Jenny Barkley is also a volcanologist joining us from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. And Jenny has been looking at the social impact of eruptions in several parts of the world. So we're very pleased to have Jenny with us. And in fact, she too has spent considerable time looking at the social impacts of the Soufriere Hills and the eruptions on Montserrat. So we're very pleased to have all of you with us. And we want to get straight into the discussions. So, firstly, I'm eager to find out, as well as I'm sure many members of the public and listening audience, is where were you on the 18th of July? Can you give us some insight as to what that day looked like for you? And I will start with former Premier Mead.
Okay, on the 18th of July, it was just another regular day starting on the 18th. Later in the day, there was a funeral for one of our former teachers and principal, Leslie Thomas. Moving from that, there was a church service in Long Ground where my wife was preaching. So in the evening, we went to Long Ground, and then the bus driver who was living next door, Hogan, actually came across, called me from the back of the church where I normally sit, and said, "Chief, the volcano is erupting." I said, "Okay, look, let's stop making jokes." Because clearly we grew up understanding that we had a dormant volcano. It was actually taught in schools. Then he said to me, "The governor is on the radio, Rose Willock is on the radio." So I said, "Okay, let me come next door." So I then indicated to my wife, "Look, I've got to go." So I asked the bus driver to give me a ride down, and life was not the same after that, because what was required now is that we set up the Emergency Operations Center at police headquarters. We called the Seismic Research Unit in Trinidad. We had people from Kinsale where the ash started falling, didn't know what was happening, so they moved into Plymouth. And then by the next day, Lloyd Lynch and two other members from the UE Seismic Research Center came to Montserrat, and then went out into the hills. We called them the Three Musketeers. And then they told us, look, there was just a little eruption of the volcano. So in effect, that was the day. Then after that, it was just long 18-hour days. You stayed in the office. You had to do what you had to do, setting up the first MVO, let's call it the MVO then, which was set up just behind the new Parliament buildings. And since that time, the MVO has moved 4 times. So this is their 5th location in Montserrat, which is their final home.
Okay, interesting, fascinating. And Major Ryan, what was your experience of that day like?
Actually, I had just graduated from the technical college. I was working as an electrician. Adrian Ryan and myself, we were doing some work on the ground floor of Mr. Ryan's supermarket. I think it's called Shamrock Mart, which was just across from the Shamrock parking lot in Plymouth. It was a Tuesday. I was the Sergeant Major of the Cadet Corps. I knew I would be working late, so there were no plans to go to training on that day. However, when we came out of the building, we started hearing ramblings. People were wondering, because there was this jet plane sound.
Yes.
People were actually wondering, since when it takes so long for a plane to pass Montserrat. So eventually, I heard on the radio, Defense Force should fall in. So as a senior member of the Cadet Corps, I went home, put on my uniform, and I came back. The same evening, an observation post was set up, I think someplace in Amersham, to actually monitor the site where this team was coming out of. And the following morning, I was part of a team that relieved that first group, and it was interesting. We went up there this morning, the following morning, it was just black ash. I think the guys were actually underneath the Jeep. The Land Rover was an open cabin type at the time. So that's how it all started for me, certainly.
Wow. And Dr. Robinson, Richie Robinson, if you're hearing us now, and I'm sure you are, I'm interested to hear what your perspective of what it was. What was that day like for you? What were you doing, and what was your first experience of the Sophia Hills eruption?
Well, I was in Trinidad at the time, and quite interestingly, the head of seismic, Dr. Ahmed at the time, he was actually attending a scientific conference that was being held in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and he was making a presentation on the elevated seismicity we were having in Montserrat. So he was actually on that same day giving his presentation about the earthquakes that we were having prior to the eruption that then started. So I was at seismic, and we got the news. I think we would have gotten the news from the equivalent of your emergency management agency in Montserrat that something had happened. And we then quickly mobilized the team, which, as Ruben said, was consistent of Lloyd Lynch. I believe there were 2 other technicians with him who went up the next day because we realized exactly what was happening. And well, from then things just went. Basically, how things would normally operate. You had elevated seismicity before, so we weren't, and we had teams in Montserrat from time to time. But whether or not you were going to actually have an eruption or not was a question. So when it actually started, one of the first things that you do is try to get people there so that you could get boots on the ground and real-time monitoring and information to the government as quickly as possible. And the quickest we could get someone there was Lloyd, who was there, I think, by the next day or 2. And he went into the field and confirmed what was being reported, that you had some sort of phreatic stage of an eruption happening. Then not it went to the next stage was another thing. So one of the things that we do quickly was to put in new stations and make sure that somebody was on the ground. So Lloyd stayed there for a time, and then we started to rotate people in. So I actually physically went there, I think about 2 or 3 weeks after it had actually started. But on the day itself, yeah, I mean, we were in Trinidad, and things just picked up. And we just mobilized people and equipment and to respond to what was actually happening.
Yes, rapid deployment, and interesting as well. Now, Jenny, what was your first experience of the Sophia Hills eruption of 18th July? Where were you? What were you hearing? Hello.
So my story is of the 18th of July is obviously not very interesting. I was in the UK. My very first experience of Super Hills, I didn't come out until just after the very first pyroclastic flow on the 3rd of April in 1996. But obviously what there was an awareness of was the extremely rapid and timely response that there was from Seismic Research Centre in response to that activity, and that they had been aware of the elevated seismicity and the unrest, as they call it, for a while.
Thank you. Right. So, Dr. Robinson, Richie, you mentioned that there was some earthquakes before. There was some sort of feeling that activity was building. And as former Premier mentioned as well, when I was going to school, we were told too that the volcano is dormant. And dormant in my mind, I was just dead, it's not going to reawake. But I'm wondering how much of pre-1995 were there warnings that the Sophia Hills volcano would erupt? What was the feeling like? What was the advice like? Former Premier?
Well, after the eruption started, then we recognized somewhere along the line there was a WAJ report, which was done sitting on the shelf. People like myself had never heard of WAJ, had never heard of no volcano report, because I had clearly not lived in Montserrat for some time. And then we realized that approximately every 30 years or so, that the volcano had elevated activities. But it never went beyond elevated activities. And therefore, in the initial stages, nobody really expected it to go beyond 3 to 4 weeks, a month, thereabouts. Didn't expect it to get into the stage where it went into dome growing and so forth. So everything for us was brand new. So we had to create ways of doing things in Montserrat. And over the years, I think the MVO has built itself into one of the more reputable institutions internationally.
And Dr. Robinson, from your scientific perspective, what was happening? What was being said at the SRC, which I believe was the SRU at the time, Seismic Research Unit, pre-1995. What was the scientific community thinking in terms of, could there be another eruption on Montserrat? Were there warning signs?
Vita, hindsight is a interesting thing, huh? But clearly before 95, the volcano had indicated that it wasn't really dead, something could happen. It had had these 30-year cycles, as Mr. Media indicated, where you had periods of increased seismicity. So we had in the 30s, the 60s, and then you could say more or less in the 90s, we started to have something. It got increasingly intense, so much so that in 1994, if you lived in Plymouth, you would have been hard pressed to think that you didn't really have something unusual going on, because you had earthquakes that were being felt. And when you get to the stage where you're starting to have volcanic earthquakes being felt, it's an indication that something could happen. Of course, you had these periods before. You had periods where you had a lot of earthquakes associated with Sophia Hills, and then it had not gone to an eruption. So to say that we knew that something could happen this time, I don't think we knew for sure, but we knew certainly something unusual was happening at the volcano. So that the number of stations that we had in Montserrat operating by 1995 when it erupted was much more than we had, say, 2 years before. Because again, how you operate is that, there's a long period before eruptions happen in the region, or when it gets close to eruption happening, we usually intensify the monitoring. So in 95, you didn't know it was going to erupt, but it wasn't really too unusual, and a number of things happened. For example, in 95, when I actually went to Montserrat twice in 95. I had gone to Montserrat earlier in the year when the EOC had opened. The EOC had a big new building that they had made that they had built, the headquarters quite close to the police station, where the police station used to be in Plymouth. And we actually came there, a team from Seismic came, myself, William Ambe, and Jody Vine, who was a collaborator from the US. And we actually put on a display explaining about the volcano. Dr. Ambe went to various schools. He spoke to various chambers, various stakeholders in Montserrat. We actually had people came to EOC and we gave them presentations about the volcano, about the fact that you had a volcano that could erupt. We didn't know it was going to erupt, but certainly we had intensified the monitoring and intensified the amount of outreach we did. So that in 95, when we had the phreatics, we weren't totally surprised that something was happening. Of course, our messaging wasn't as good as we would have liked. Clearly, people in Montserrat didn't get that message that this was not dead. So that when it actually happened, they were all very surprised, including the authorities, which has actually taught us a lesson. So we do a lot more in terms of outreach now. In fact, Montserrat taught us that we need to get out there and get the message out that we have volcanoes that could erupt, and there's a lot more information coming out now, which is why we work with people like Professor Barkley to get information out to people in various stages. That's why you have, for example, the exhibition that you have in Montserrat, that nice volcano mountain glow and the website. All of that is coming out of the fact that we now realize we have to get that message out that you really have to live with this volcano. You can't ignore it. You can't say it's dormant. At some point, it will do things again in the future.
And that it did. So, taking the last evacuation order for Plymouth and the villages south of Montserrat, south of Plymouth, in 1996 as an example of the most significant impact of the eruption at the time, could you all explain to us what triggered this? What were some of the difficulties you had in maintaining the evacuation order? And I'm interested particularly to hear, from Premier Meade and Major Alvin on that. Were there any doubts at any time, about how useful it was to keep people out of Plymouth at that time?
Well, let's not start with Plymouth. Let's start with the first evacuations.
Okay.
The first evacuations actually started with the people in Long Ground. And Long Ground, Bethel area were the most evacuated community in Montserrat up to that stage. Back in those days, we were saying to people, pack an overnight bag, pack your medications, pack your essential documents, because we expected you to be out for a couple of weeks or a couple of days, not beyond that. But by the time we got around to the southern part of the island, because we were keeping the island open as far as possible, because one never anticipated going to that stage. Essentially, the governor and I would go on the radio and announce an evacuation. And I can recall one night we decided, yes, there will be an evacuation tomorrow. Let's not wait until tomorrow to do the recording. Let's go to the Radio Montserrat, which was at Lovers Lane at the time, around midnight to do the evacuation statements. When we came out of Radio Montserrat and we came back down to the main road, cars were lined off from Groves all the way to Fox's Bay Turning. The fact that the governor and I were going to Radio Montserrat at that time triggered some discussion. There were no WhatsApp back in those days. There were very little cell phone activity. So I said to the governor, we don't really have to do much in terms of getting people moving because they really will move. In the southern part of the island, which included Plymouth, the major issue was Gage's Wall, whether or not Gage's Wall will hold. So we kept monitoring it, and Dr. Ambe, for example, along with his team, basically understood on a small island you keep people at home for as long as possible. But it meant that they had to very intensely monitor the volcanic activities. So when we had to ask people to move, it was an overnight thing. I can recall when we had to move Plymouth, and let's deal with Plymouth before we move south. I actually took the decision to call a few persons before the official announcement. One was Cable and Wireless, because clearly you needed to have the telecommunication system set up. The other one would have been the medical personnel at the hospital to get them prepared to move. And the other one would have been Monlek at the time. Because you wanted a smooth transition. And you also wanted to allow persons who are working in those essential services the time off to be able to do things. But once the scientists said move, there was very little, if any, hesitation or too many questions being asked. I can recall at times that you'd be at home and you always kept your radio on because there's always Charlie Mike, you need to log in. And it meant that you had to be there at all times, thinking about what to do next, how to do things. The other thing is that there are some persons who not mentioned very frequently, and that would be people like the Defense Force, who were embodied. They were at Sturge Park. They were sleeping in the open, sleeping in the tent, sleeping in the pavilion, and they did yeoman duty. They used to be at Tar River looking at the hill every night, and I remember going up there one night, and there was one corporal who we knew was deadly afraid of the volcano. He would not sleep. He will not turn his back on the volcano. But they did their duty. People like Billy Darrow and Luke were from the police service, and we had them climbing up Chances Mountain, climbing up Gage's Wall at night. One night, actually, that we couldn't retrieve them by helicopter. They had to sleep up there. And this is a kind of effort which has been made by a lot of people. So when we were asked to move St. Patrick's, and people were always saying, okay, no, you need to move them out, and we're saying, no, we're going to keep them for as long as we possibly can. When we got the call that, look, the Gage's Wall may actually be in stress, we then made the call, we have to move everybody out. And people willingly moved in the main. They willingly moved and they came out. Although nothing happened initially, people still moved out once government asked them to move. The other problem would clearly have been, where do you put persons? Because our emergency operations focus on short-term accommodation, which would be for hurricanes. We never in our wildest dreams figure, one, you had to move your capital, you had to move 3/4 of your population, where to put them, how to feed them, how to look after them. Those were all issues, and we had to learn as we went along. But we did, and the people did what they had to do. The other area is how do you feed all these people? So we got the merchants involved. We started distributing food to whoever wanted food. And then later on, we came into a food voucher system where whoever relocated and needed food vouchers, just join the line and you get your food vouchers. No questions asked. The farmers, on the other hand, continued to farm, especially in the Farrells area. Later on, we had started farms in the Trans area, which was irrigated farming. And I can recall going up to Farrells, looking at an escape route in the event that farmers needed to get out of there very quickly. And we actually cut a route going up Windy Hill, coming down through Hollander Estate, told all the farmers, don't take your keys out of your vehicle and always park with your head out. And if you hear additional rock falls coming on the hill, do not wait for an evacuation or to get out of there. Unfortunately, and this was after my time, some of the farmers moved late. There are a couple who actually, without calling their names, who I had the pleasure of having discussions with previously, and they did the right thing. They went through the exit route which he asked them to, and they've survived.
Thank you. What I find fascinating there is your personal touch that you had, in managing this volcano, the boots on the ground, going to Chances Peak, going to speak to farmers, going and looking and seeing and feeling what was actually happening on the ground. That connection looks like it feels like a sort of masterclass in leadership crisis.
Well, the connection went a little differently, and I'll just add a little humor to this, is that I did not believe that I can monitor the volcano just listening to what the scientists were saying. So 3 or 4 times a week, I will go to Chances Peak with them, even though the mountain was still exploding. And I can recall at one stage, having come down from the mountain, Governor and myself had to do broadcasts every night, and you had to find something to keep the hope and the spirit of people alive. I saw a swarm of butterflies, yellow butterflies, on the mountain. So I came down and I figured I'll put it in the evening broadcast. And the political persons of the day, my good friend and cousin David Brand, blew it up and said I was being advised by butterflies, and I then became the butterfly scientist. But it was a very hands-on approach. The chaps from the SRU came here voluntarily. They were not paid. They were not salaried. So we actually hired a cook to ensure that they were fed. And we had a lot of volunteers from Montserrat within the public service private sector who volunteered to come and look at the drums, check the what they would call picking the earthquakes by just looking at the drums and reading them. And a lot of persons in Montserrat actually came through that process and volunteered and helped. So it was a total community effort, but again, the leadership was important. And what used to happen is that the governor and I, although we had our differences from time to time, because constitutionally, disasters fell to him. But as I said to him back then, it would be rather difficult for you to say one thing, to evacuate, and I said to the people, don't evacuate. Who do you think they would follow? And from then on, we became like Batty and Po, as the Guyanese would say. You never saw us separate. We never went on radio separately, and we kept to a single message. So that again was important, that at the most senior level within government, that both the governor and the chief minister were on song, saying the same thing, and not having arguments publicly. Yes, we had private arguments and very heated arguments, but in the main, the public never were aware of our differences.
That united front, and it surely came through. Now, Professor Robinson, so what were the scientists saying at the time? What was the main trigger to call that evacuation order from a scientific perspective? I'd love to hear, your thoughts there.
Well, the evacuation, the general rationale for calling an evacuation really is to save people's lives. So we would constantly operate where we try to get information about what the volcano is doing, which is why we monitor it closely and why we had people on the ground to look at what both the remote signals from the seismometers would tell you, but also physically to see what's happening. And depending on where it is, whether or not it looks like the events that is building up to or about to exhibit could put people in harm's way, we would advise the government to evacuate. So in Montserrat in the early days, there was a lot of uncertainty. Anytime you have an eruption, you're not really sure exactly what's going to happen. So therefore, there is always a desire when you have so much uncertainty to really err on the side of caution and not put people into harm's way. So if there was anything that was happening at the time that indicated that you were moving from, certainly in the first part, you had a sort of a phreatic phase where you had basically just magma that was trying to come out, interacting with groundwater and causing explosions. And that would have affected mainly villages quite close by. That's why like Long Ground and places like that, Hermitage would have been moved first. And then as it got to the stage where you now have magma coming out and the potential for it to get explosions which are driven by fresh material, you have the potential for it to affect a wider area. So the area that you evacuate or you move out of the way would have expanded. So that's how you generally operate. And the decision to evacuate really would have been based on trying to make sure that people are not in the way of some of the nasty things that could happen from the volcano.
But one of the things, Richie, is that the important thing is that there was a meeting every night at the MVO where
that you guys attended something.
The non-scientists, that's the governor and myself would be briefed So we were always attuned to what was happening. It's not that they would call us when something is happening. We were always there, and we were always one telephone call away.
Right. So, people, we're listening. We're listening to very interesting reflections here on lessons learned and the Montserrat perspectives on the Sophia Hills volcano. And I'm encouraging you to call in if you're listening and you have a question to ask any of our guests. The telephone number for Radio ZJB is 491-7227. You can WhatsApp us on 495-2029, or please just drop a chat, a comment or a question in our Facebook live chat, and we'll be happy to hear from you. So let's keep it going and let's continue talking. And Major Ryan, so tell us about your experience in the field with the Defence Force in helping people coordinate relocations of families to shelters and so on.
I think I should start by noting the fact that I was a member of the Cadet Corps, and I think it's worth noting that the Cadet Corps did play a supporting role to the Defence Force. I didn't receive a Defence Force commission until 1999. It was Major Lynch who authorized me to act as a Defence Force sergeant, so I was acting in that role throughout the activities. Evacuating people, transport, logistics, places to take them after it was decided where the shelters will be located. That wasn't so much a problem because the evacuations were voluntary. The most difficult part was convincing some of the folks to actually move, especially the older folks. It's interesting that two common excuses they tend to typically use was that God wasn't going to let anything happen to them, and their pot is on the fire. Now, interestingly enough, back in those days, people were still, quite a few persons were still cooking on wood fire. So you had people around the back of the house, and the pot was actually on the fire. Now, there's no guarantee as to what was in the pot. But true to form, the pot was always on the fire. Eventually, you develop techniques to try and convince them. One of my favorite was, well, maybe God sent me for you. And then you see them pausing. But the good thing was that it was activities were gradual. So they got to see a sort of a build-up, so to speak. And eventually, most of them, too much was too much, so they decided to move. But it was a very good experience working alongside the Defence Force members. They treated me as one of their own, like I said. And eventually, I am now the commanding officer.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Jenny, interested to hear from you. So you've been studying the impacts of eruptions on societies in several different places in the world, as well as in Montserrat. As you said, you were on the ground here as early as the following year. And so do you know of any countries where there's been this sudden displacement, where the population had to readapt? And, what differences do you see between them and us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I guess certainly in terms of these evacuations we've just been talking about, I was around working at the MVO for quite a few of them. And one of the things that we touched on is really that kind of coming together of community in that moment. And everyone taking responsibility. But something that Richie mentioned is dealing with that uncertainty. And actually, it's a common feature of volcanic eruptions. So you have a very long-lived volcanic eruption, but most volcanic eruptions, the sort of average amount of time they go on for is 6 weeks or so. And really about 40% of them do that kind of roaring into life where they have a very abrupt start. But quite a lot of them rumble on for a while. So actually kind of in collaboration with SRC, we've been doing some work looking at some of the patterns and how what happens in the Caribbean can provide lessons elsewhere. And it's actually really common that you have these situations where people are having to make really difficult decisions about their livelihoods in the face of a long-lived eruption. and that actually the volcano does something a bit bigger after it's already been erupting for a while. So there's some very powerful lessons in terms of how the community coped and some of the things that weren't done in succession. And it's also inspired Richie and I, Professor Robertson and I have been looking more recently back at the archives here and in the Caribbean and in the UK at some of the lessons that should have been learned by the UK government from earlier eruptions elsewhere in the Caribbean as well. So my real hope is that we do take a really critical look back, but also really critically look at what we're doing to try and make sure that the next community that's impacted by this and has to cope with this kind of uncertainty does better.
Thank you very much. And, Professor Robinson, you, I believe, are sort of Vincentian from birth, if I'm correct. And I know in St. Vincent there is a volcano that, is pretty much quiet. And Sophia Hills volcano is active, but we don't have the explosions, we don't have the dome growth. And it's interesting to hear from your perspective, what are some of those difficulties that we experience in monitoring the volcano in these types of circumstances? But stick a pin right there, because we've got a caller and I'm interested to hear what that caller has to say. Welcome to MVO Talks, caller. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I always like to identify who I am. I'm Justin Hero Castle, and especially the number one Montserrat leader is in the studio at the moment, retired unfortunately too early. I would like to ask him to explain to the public, because on a program on Tuesday night, I refer to him as the butterfly scientist. I want him to explain to the public how he acquired that name. I think he had to do with regrowth of the vegetation. I don't know how to kind of give him a lead sentence here. So I'd like him to explain how he acquired the name butterfly scientist. Thank you very much.
Well, actually, I'd mentioned that previously. Clearly, you were not listening at the time, but I'll go through it very quickly. Going to the volcano pretty much 3 to 4 days a week with Dr. Ambe and his team, and having to go on radio every night, basically keeping people quiet and people then calm. One day we went up, and when we went up, there was a swarm of yellow butterflies hovering at Chance's Peak. And I came back down and I used it in the evening broadcast. And my good friend David Brand, who was then opposition member at the time, then used it as a political joke, calling me the butterfly scientist, because, as he said, I was taking advice from butterflies.
So there you have it. Mr. Justin Hero Castle. And so, back to you, Professor Robinson. And you were talking a little bit about the difficulties in monitoring the volcano, advising government and informing the population when you have a volcano that is active, but we don't see the eruptions. We're not seeing the pyroclastic flows and the dome growth. Go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, it's in the region, in the Caribbean region, we are blessed, and I guess to a certain extent not so blessed, by having volcanoes that don't erupt very often. So which means that you could live here for a lot of your life and you never experience an eruption, and therefore your perception is that the volcanoes are really very peaceful and not harmful at all. So monitoring them in that situation and keeping people on the guard for them is usually a challenge. But because of the fact that at Seismic, the agency that is responsible for doing that in the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean, we've been doing it for a long time. We certainly, we have developed ways in which we do it. I mean, the main thing really is to keep a network of stations that at least when things have moved from a stage where it's sort of background to some elevated stage. And certainly, as I said before, one of the things that Montserrat has taught us to invest heavily in is ongoing education, public education, getting information to the public that these things are things that we have to, systems that we have to live with, but that from time to time they could erupt and they could pose harm, and making sure that people are aware of that. And as Professor Barkley said, working on the historical record to find out what lessons we can learn from the past, and making sure that we don't repeat them, or at least we inform the people in the region, share that message with them so that they know how they have dealt with them in the past. So it's an ongoing challenge. In the case of St. Vincent that you mentioned, because of the fact that St. Vincent is one of the more active systems in the region, St. Vincent have had at least one explosive eruption every 100 years for the last, well, for as long as people have lived in St. Vincent, essentially. So if you ask any Vincentian, unlike Montserrat before 95, if you ask any Vincentian about soufre in St. Vincent, they will tell you it is not dead. They will tell you that it could erupt, and that they will tell you that they themselves or their parents or their grandparents, somebody have experienced some aspect of an eruption, and therefore they take it a lot seriously. Certainly, if the mountain starts rumbling, they would do the sensible thing, which is move off the mountain and head south. So it's not, in the case of St. Vincent, it's not that difficult to keep people aware and informed and sort of at a level of preparedness for the volcano. It becomes more challenging in places where you have had no eruption. For example, Montserrat before 95, St. Lucia's, St. Dominica, all of the other islands that have one volcano, at least one that can erupt. It's more challenging because people haven't experienced it. And finally, if we look at one of the things that Montserrat could teach the rest of the region is what a volcano can do. And I think one of the lessons from Montserrat is really to the rest of the Caribbean, that volcanoes do erupt, even though they look very peaceful and benign, and they're fantastic places to live on. And if they erupt, they can have tremendous impact, and therefore we have to prepare for the possibility of them eruption. That's certainly something that Montserrat is a living example of, and how to deal with it, really.
Thank you. And from a disaster management perspective, Major Ryan, what do you see as some of the difficulties, some of the challenges in advising, informing the public in regards to the risk that we still face?
Well, it's not so much of a difficulty, but as I said, part of the lessons learned is that we do realize that we do need to get that information out there for the folks and have it constant. And in that light, we do have a dedicated information outreach officer at the department, Shaylin Queely, who does a fantastic job, if I might say, in doing that. So it's just to constantly remind folks that the volcano is still there, and we're into the hurricane season. But I like to say, you keep both eyes open because we deal with all hazards.
And Jenny, interesting to hear from you as well, your perspective in terms of those challenges and keeping people informed. You've done a tremendous amount of work on the education and outreach, especially most recently on the Disaster Pass project. But before I get to you, 1 minute, because we have some caller on the radio. MVO Talks, welcome. Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, Julian Romeo.
Good morning, sir. Go ahead.
I was listening to the butterflies thing, and I want to say publicly, Mr. Mead. I want to say publicly, with Mr. Mead being present, the ex-premier, that he was criticized heavily for the butterfly comment. The truth is that had he not been that positive during those times, all of us would have been in Birmingham by now, and we would have been just probably a military base in Montserrat. Had he not been very positive about what went on and what he saw at the time, we definitely would not be here in Montserrat. I believe one of the problems that we've had during that time is that what should have happened if a lot more people went up in the helicopter and saw exactly what Ambi and Ruben T. Mead and other people were saying, it would have been much better understood that it was like, throwing porridge on the top of a mountain and the porridge running down the flanks of the mountain. We didn't understand, because there was 1 week, I remember, after July 18, we went up into Tar River to look at the flow that was coming down Tar River. I mean, when you think back at it, it makes the hair and your hands stand up, because what happened? the danger that we never really understood. But like I said, if we had the perspective that the scientists and Mr. Meade had, if you went up in a helicopter and really saw it, you realize that on the north end was as safe as anywhere else. So for Mr. Meade, I give him credit for, had it not been for him and the yellow butterflies and the positive thing that he said, we would have been in Birmingham. Thank you.
And Vita, if I may, from a personal perspective, I tend to be military minded, so I'm apolitical. But I've always took that statement to mean as a message of hope. Remember, during those days, people were worrying about the gas, the ash. As a matter of fact, there were several studies throughout the years as to what effects the ash had on the population. So, from a personal perspective, I took it as a message of hope. Yes.
But if I may, in responding to Julian, there was a point in time when the British basically were trying to get all of us off Montserrat, and that's a fact. There was the Camp Lightfoot situation in Antigua. There was also the situation where a colleague prime minister of mine from Barbados, who unfortunately is in hospital now as a retired prime minister, Owen Arthur, called me and said, Ruben, I just got a call from the British government, and we have agreed to accept 1,000 persons here in Barbados. And a similar call has gone to all the other heads where they're trying to farm Montserratians out across the Caribbean to as far as Belize. I then called the Secretary General of CARICOM, who happened to have been on a trip in Africa. And I said to him, we are colleagues and friends, because quite a number of us are graduates of UWI Mona and may have been at Mona around the same time. And I said to him, there's no such call by the people of Montserrat. The people of Montserrat will not be moving from Montserrat like that. We're not going into Camp Lightfoot. We're not going to the other territories unless people want to go there voluntarily. What the British need to do is that we are British citizens and we must be treated as such, and therefore allow us to go to the UK, those who wish to go. At that particular point in time, I said government will not be paying for anyone to go to the UK. If they wish to go, they can go, other than persons who really needed to go. We provided assistance to a couple of those. But there were a couple of us, City John was one of them, who said categorically, we will not be leaving Montserrat. We will not abandon this country. Montserrat will not be a military base. Fortunately, the British government eventually succumbed and allowed Montserratians to go to the UK, getting the full benefits in the UK. So it was a fight, but they eventually conceded and agreed. But had we not stood up to them, Montserrat would have been pretty much a base for the management of the volcano and possibly a military base.
Thank you for that. And that song comes to mind from Pops Morris. Thank you for holding on. And so many of us wouldn't have the opportunities today that we have on Montserrat, had it not been for that decision for us to bind together as a community and deal with whatever the circumstances would be and rise above it. And to do that took leadership. And for you,
before
like
you bring Jenny in, can I just mention a couple of things? I think they're important as a lesson going forward. When we approached the British government for housing at the time, they said no. They ring-fenced £5 million to relocate people off Montserrat, and I said, I'm not going to accept it. But they said they will keep it ring-fenced. So I said, look, if you really want to show that you're supporting Montserrat, and we're looking at the WAJ report said anything north of the secondary school was safe and people can remain here. When they insisted on not providing assistance, I actually went to the Caribbean Development Bank. I went to my colleague heads of the overseas territories. Each of the overseas territories gave me $40,000 to build a housing unit. Back then, we were building T111 temporary units. CDB, in a meeting in Guadeloupe, said to me, Ruben, we, amongst your colleagues here, have decided to give you $1 million left over from the BNTF, but you know you cannot use it. It will not be dispersed immediately. I said all I need is your approval in writing that the funds are available. I know the rules of the game. By the time you disperse the money, I would have spent all of it. And that is how we ended up with the family units located across Montserrat, starting a housing program. Within any situation like this, yes, people will claim government could have done more in terms of